Hi everyone, welcome back. So far for this unit, we have talked about cell transport. So that means the structure of the cell membrane, the function of the cell membrane, and then how the cell membrane is able to perform its function of controlling what comes in and out of the cell. Through that, we looked at passive and active transport. And then we looked at two examples of when this happens in your cell with two different cellular processes. One being photosynthesis, which is what plants use. They use sunlight to eventually make glucose, which is our primary food source. They're also able to recycle the air that we breathe. So they use the carbon dioxide that we breathe out, and they give us oxygen to breathe back in. The second process was cellular respiration. And so this happens in plants and animals, but this is how our bodies use the oxygen that we're breathing in, uses the glucose that we are eating, and it helps us to convert this to the chemical energy, ATP, that our bodies need in order to function. So today we're going to be going into detail about the respiratory system to see or explore how we actually get this gas into our bodies and out of our bodies. When I say gas, I mean oxygen. We breathe in oxygen and we breathe out carbon dioxide. So we're going to be looking at how those two gases enter and exit our bodies so that we can, again, better understand this process of cellular respiration. So for the respiratory system, this is talking about your lungs and your airway in terms of breathing. So the word respire or respire is talking about your breathing. It's talking about your lungs. So yes, we are going to be talking about your lungs, but we also are going to be talking about the other parts of the respiratory system. So just to reiterate, for the respiratory system, the function is to get oxygen into the body and to get carbon dioxide out of the body. So we are exchanging oxygen and carbon dioxide. They are both gases, and that is why this process is known as gas exchange. On the MCAS, they will and probably will use this terminology of gas exchange, especially in relation to the respiratory system and eventually the circulatory system. So know that when they are talking about this gas exchange, they're talking about trading oxygen and carbon dioxide. So we're going to be going through the different parts of the respiratory system. And these are all of the different parts we're going to be talking about. So as we go through, essentially, we're going to be filling in this chart together. So feel free to do this in your notes, but a lot of these words are also in your vocab notebook. So this is a good reminder if you don't have your notebook open already. Open up your vocab notebook. Make sure that you are watching this video as well as pausing and filling in your vocab notebook at the same time when we come across one of the words you are responsible for. And if you would like, you can also open up this slide deck and have that to help you follow along with what this presentation is showing you. So we're going to be going through all these different parts of the respiratory system. As we go through these different parts, some of them will have a second function, but the main function of all of these parts is basically just a tube for air to travel through. All right, so let's start with where oxygen would enter the body. So we're going to be following the path of oxygen through the body. And basically, the path of carbon dioxide would just be the opposite of what we're doing right now. So your nose and your mouth, but we're going to focus on the nose. Your nose is where oxygen will enter the body through. This is where we breathe from. The other note here, and of course, this is where carbon dioxide would exit the body when you breathe out. So breathing in is inhale, breathing out is exhale. As we go through the different parts of the respiratory system too, this diagram is going to be the same on every single slide. And I have this little smiley face right here representing our oxygen molecule. So we're going to follow this oxygen molecule through the respiratory system. I even have the little "you are here" for the map. I think I'm hilarious. Okay, moving on. So After the nose, air is going to pass into what we call the nasal cavity, or I should say oxygen is going to pass into the nasal cavity. So you have a space right behind your nose, as you can see right here, called the nasal cavity. So like inside your face, right in here, that's where your nasal cavity would be. This is to help humidify the air that we breathe in. So especially in the wintertime when the air can get really, really dry, when we breathe in the air, we do want it at a certain temperature and a certain humidity. That way, the air isn't also drying out some of our inside organs and the tubes that the air flows through. So that's the nasal cavity's job. What I should say is that if your nasal cavity is having a hard time humidifying the air that we breathe in, that's what can lead to getting some bloody noses during the wintertime, too. All right, so after the nasal cavity, your oxygen is going to move into this area called the pharynx. So the pharynx is essentially just a fancy science word for the back of your throat. So if you like open your mouth and say ah, all the way back there is your pharynx. This is like where your tongue connects to your throat, way back here. And it's just another passageway for air. So right after the pharynx, they are like very close together. You have this flap of skin called the epiglottis. So as you can see, our oxygen is still kind of in this area right here. The pharynx is right here. The epiglottis is right here. Now keep in mind, you have two tubes that go through your neck and sort of down your chest area. One tube is the esophagus, and that is for food. So we looked at that with the digestive system. The tube we're looking at today is the trachea. So that's your airway tube. So when you like swallow food and start coughing and you're like, oh, it went down the wrong tube. Yeah, it literally did go down the wrong tube. So the epiglottis is there to try to stop that from happening. So it's meant to prevent food or drink from going into your trachea and eventually your lungs. So basically what happens is that when you do go to swallow food or liquid, this epiglottis, it's a little flap of skin, it ends up covering your trachea or covering your airway to feed the food or liquid into your esophagus so it can go to your stomach. So you can actually try this out at home right now as like a mini experiment. But it is impossible to breathe and swallow simultaneously. It is impossible to breathe and swallow at the same time. And this is because of the epiglottis covering your airway when you go to swallow. So it's that safeguard to make sure that food and water are going down the right tube. So take a second, try to breathe and swallow at the same time. You won't be able to do it. Some people think they can, but really what's happening is that they are either like breathing right before or right after they swallow, and then they sit there all proud of themselves. That's not how it works. You have to do it at the same time. That was aggressive. I don't know why it was so aggressive. Anyway, after the epiglottis, we move into this area called your larynx. So keep in mind there's something called a pharynx and there's something called a larynx. The larynx is your voice box. So this is where your vocal cords are located. So that's why we're right here in the body. This is basically, you'll see this more commonly in males, but this is what we refer to as the Adam's apple. So it's that thing that sticks out in your throat right here. And with males, you can sometimes see it like move up and down as they talk or as they swallow, but that is the larynx. That's your voice box. The reason why we see it more in males than in females is males tend to have a deeper voice than females do. And so in order to create those lower tones that we hear, it needs to be a larger voice box to create those deeper tones that we hear usually from a male voice. You can still see it in females sometimes depending on the tone of their voice. But more commonly, you would see the Adam's apple in males. Everybody has one. It's just the females are usually smaller. So you can take a second and actually like put your finger on your throat right here where your larynx is located, and you'll feel the vibration of your voice coming up through your throat. You can also, this is how SpongeBob makes his little like laugh thing, the guy who does SpongeBob's voice. He just like moves his finger over his larynx as he talks, as you can see, and that's how SpongeBob is able to make his laugh. Fun fact right there. Anyway, after the larynx, after your voice box, you have the trachea. So that is the tube that is running down the middle of your chest, and it's just another passageway for air moving through the chest cavity, moving through the chest area. So after the trachea, keep in mind you have two lungs. You have a right lung and a left lung. And so the trachea needs to split off. You come to like a fork in the road. So for your bronchial tubes, these are basically just like an extension of the trachea, either going to the right lung or going to the left lung. So the bronchial tubes, like I said, they are a branching tube from the trachea, and there's one for each lung. So I decided to move towards the left lung. So keep in mind when I'm looking at this person, I'm labeling left and right based off of, I'm going to go with it's a him. I'm going to call it a him. Let's call him Joe. So I'm going to label this according to Joe's anatomy. So Joe, he's facing us. So this would be his left side. So I'm going to call this his left lung. All right, so after the bronchial tubes, basically we just branch off into smaller tubes inside of the lung. So the bronchioles are these smaller branches of the bronchial tubes, and they are inside the actual lung itself. So we are now inside of Joe's left lung right here. The last place for air to flow through, or for oxygen to flow through, is this thing called the alveoli. So again, we are still in Joe's left lung, but we are now sort of like at the ends of the air tube. So there's no more tubes for air to flow through. And basically the alveoli are used for gas exchange between the respiratory system and the circulatory system. So this is where those two systems connect. Again, on MCAS, they like to ask questions about this gas exchange between the alveoli and the circulatory system. So if we zoom in on what the alveoli look like, I think they kind of look like little cauliflower sacks. Kind of like that white broccoli look. But basically, this would be a bronchiole, and then it leads into these air sacs over here. And these air sacs are the alveoli. Now, surrounding the alveoli, you have really tiny blood vessels called capillaries. And what's happening is the oxygen is able to diffuse from the alveoli into the capillary that is surrounding that particular alveoli. So that's how we're able to move oxygen from the respiratory system into the circulatory system. Keep in mind, carbon dioxide would just go the opposite direction. So carbon dioxide would go from a capillary surrounding the alveoli, and it would diffuse into the alveoli itself. And then from the alveoli, in order to exhale, the carbon dioxide would go from the alveoli to the bronchioles, to the bronchial tube, to the trachea, through the larynx, through the epiglottis, through the pharynx, into the nasal cavity, and out through the nose. So like I said, oxygen, we followed the path of oxygen through our diagram of Joe right here, but carbon dioxide would be just going through these slides in the opposite order. There is one more part of the respiratory system that we have to talk about, and that is the diaphragm. So the diaphragm, air does not actually flow through the diaphragm. The diaphragm is a muscle. So there is a muscle right here underneath the lungs, and it's this sheet of muscle that actually goes through your entire chest cavity. What this does is it creates a closed pressure system. And so the idea is that when we breathe in, we're not actually like sucking air into our nose. The diaphragm is a muscle, so it either expands your chest cavity or contracts your chest cavity. So when it expands your chest cavity, it pulls air in to your lungs, and then when it contracts your chest cavity, it pushes air out of your lungs. So because of this physics that we're getting into for the respiratory system, what I can say is that science never sucks. There literally is no such thing as sucking in science. Yes, I love that joke. Okay. But the idea is, like I said, this sheet of muscle right here called the diaphragm is what is in control of us inhaling and us exhaling. So when the diaphragm contracts, the chest cavity is able to enlarge. So this is very similar if you've ever taken a balloon and instead of blowing it up the correct way, you put the other end in your mouth and you like sucked on it and you're able to blow it up a little bit that way. That's sort of how the diaphragm works with the lungs. So basically, like I said, the diaphragm contracts, it enlarges the chest cavity, so air is pushed into the lungs. When the diaphragm relaxes, the chest cavity shrinks and the air is pushed out of the lungs. All right, so that would be the end of the respiratory system. The main component that you need to walk away with right now is the alveoli is the location of gas exchange. They will be asking this on the MCAS. The alveoli is the location of gas exchange between the respiratory system and the circulatory system. So at this point, you need to make sure that you have your vocab notebook, you filled out all of the vocab words that you are responsible for. And then in the next video, we're going to be talking about the circulatory system, because now that the oxygen has diffused into some blood vessels, we are now in the circulatory system. So we need to talk about how the oxygen is then transported to all the different cells in your body so that it can be used for cellular respiration.